At brunch she said, "I'm calling off the wedding." This is the story of Michael Calloway and his fiancée Emily Vanek. They had been together for 4 years before Michael proposed. Not with grand theater, but with her grandmother's ring and a quiet evening at home. The kind of proposal that said, "I know you," rather than "watch me." Emily said yes with tears she couldn't explain, and for a long time neither of them examined those tears too closely. Their relationship had always been comfortable in the way that a well-worn chair is comfortable, reliable, shaped to the body, easy to take for granted. What neither of them understood, not yet, was that comfort and contentment are not the same thing, and that Emily had spent years confusing the two. The tension between them was not loud. It never announced itself. It moved instead like groundwater, invisible beneath the surface, slowly eroding the foundation of something both of them had assumed was solid. The apartment they shared on Briar Street had a particular smell on Sunday mornings. Coffee and the faint mustiness of old radiators. And Michael had come to love that smell in the unremarkable way. You love anything that means home. He was 31, a structural engineer who thought in load-bearing principles and stress tolerances. A man who trusted what he could measure. He was not emotionally unavailable in the dramatic sense. He listened, he remembered, he showed up, but there was something in him that had always preferred the architecture of a relationship to its weather. He was better at building than at tending, and he did not always notice when something needed attention until it had already begun to lean. Emily was 29 and worked in communications for a nonprofit, a job she was good at but had never loved. She was sharp in conversation and privately restless. The kind of person who was always slightly more animated around new people than around familiar ones. This was not a flaw exactly. It was just the way she was wired, drawn toward novelty the way certain plants turn toward light. Michael knew this about her. What he didn't know was how to account for it, how to keep being new enough for someone who craved the feeling of being newly known. The wedding was 4 months away. They had booked a venue outside the city, a restored farmhouse with barn doors and string lights, the kind of place Emily had pinned obsessively 2 years earlier, and that now, when she looked at the photos on her phone, produced in her something closer to dread than anticipation. She did not examine that dread. She told herself it was normal. Bridal anxiety. Everyone felt it. They were in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening when she mentioned, almost casually, that she'd run into an old friend, someone from her college years, a man named Owen Draper, who had moved back to the city after years abroad. She said it while rinsing a wine glass, her back to Michael, and her voice had the particular flatness of someone trying to make something sound smaller than it is. Owen Draper, Michael repeated, not suspiciously, just placing the name. Wasn't he the one who lived in Portugal for a while? Spain, she said. He was in Madrid. Right. Michael looked up from his laptop. How is he? Good. He's doing well. She turned off the tap. We're grabbing coffee sometime, just to catch up. Michael nodded and returned to his screen, and that was the end of it. There was nothing in that conversation to alarm him. People had old friends. Old friends returned to cities. Coffee was just coffee. What he didn't see, because she was still facing the sink, was the small, involuntary smile that crossed her face when she said the name Owen. Not a guilty smile, something more complicated than that, something that looked almost like relief. They ate dinner that night and talked about the catering deposit and whether her parents could arrive on Thursday rather than Friday, and Michael reached across the table at some point and covered her hand with his, and she let him, and they were comfortable together. And the evening passed the way evenings do when everything is still technically fine. But later, lying beside him in the dark while he slept, Emily stared at the ceiling for a long time. The apartment breathed around her. The radiator knocked once, twice. She thought about the way Owen had looked at her that afternoon, like she was someone worth discovering, and she felt something move in her chest that she had not felt in a long time. She told herself it was nothing. It was not nothing. March became April and the wedding plans accelerated with the particular momentum of things that have their own gravity, pulling everyone forward whether or not they are ready. Emily attended dress fittings and tasted cake and answered texts from her mother about centerpieces, and she did all of it with the competence of someone who has learned to perform a version of themselves that is slightly larger and more certain than the one they actually inhabit. She and Owen had coffee twice, and then dinner, and then a long walk along the river that lasted 3 hours and covered, among other things, their college years, their separate trajectories, the ways in which they had each become someone slightly different from who they had expected to be. Owen was attentive in a way that felt like pressure in the best possible sense. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details. He leaned in when she spoke, He was 43 years old, not dramatically older, but enough to carry a particular kind of settled self-knowledge, the kind that reads as gravity and that Emily found, unexpectedly, almost dizzying. She told Michael she was seeing Owen occasionally. She did not hide it exactly. She simply framed it as friendship and left enough vagueness around the edges that the truth could not find traction. Michael, who believed her because he had no framework yet for not believing her, accepted the framing. He was not incurious, but he was not suspicious, and there is a difference. What was happening in him during those weeks was subtler and harder to name. He noticed that she was slightly elsewhere even when she was present, that her attention had the quality of something returned from a distance, still slightly delayed, like satellite communication. He noticed that she laughed at her phone more than she used to. He noticed that she had stopped asking for his opinion on the wedding details she'd previously consulted him on, not out of decisiveness but out of a kind of quiet withdrawal, as though she were conserving something. He mentioned none of this directly. He was not the kind of man who leads with accusation, and he was also, in some private way, afraid of what a direct question might surface. So he said nothing, and his silence became its own kind of weight. One evening she came home from what she described as dinner with her friend Natalie, and Michael was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 glasses of wine already poured, and something in his stillness, the careful stillness of someone who has been thinking for a long time, made her pause in the doorway. "You're home early," she said. "So are you," he said, which was not quite an accusation and not quite not one. She sat down across from him, picked up her glass. Natalie had an early morning. He looked at her for a moment. Not hard, not cold, just looking. The way you look at a structure you're trying to understand, trying to find where the stress is concentrated. "Are you happy?" he asked. The question surprised her, not the words. She had asked herself the same question many times, but the timing, the directness, the fact that he was asking it without apparent anger or agenda, just asking as though the answer mattered more than the asking. She took a slow sip of wine. "I'm tired," she said. "I think it's just the wedding pressure." "That's not what I asked." She looked at the table. "I'm fine, Michael." He nodded. Didn't push. The silence between them held something they both recognized but neither named, something like the particular stillness before a weather system arrives, the birds gone quiet, the air gone flat. Later that night he scrolled through her messages while she showered. He did not read more than 3 lines before he put the phone down. He sat on the edge of the bed with his hands between his knees and breathed steadily. He was not a man who fell apart immediately. He was the kind of man who, when a structure shows signs of failure, first tries to understand the load before deciding what to do about it. He sat there for a long time. When she came out of the bathroom in her robe, toweling her hair, he said nothing. He said nothing for 6 more days. The brunch was her idea, a casual gathering at their friend David and Petra's house, the kind of thing they did every month or so. 4 couples and too much food and the easy conversation of people who have known each other long enough to stop performing. Michael agreed to go. He had agreed to most things in the preceding 2 weeks with a measured compliance that Emily had perhaps mistaken for normalcy. There were 8 of them around the table when it happened. Mimosas, a frittata, late morning light through the kitchen windows. The conversation had been moving through the ordinary channels. Someone's job change, someone's new apartment. When Emily put down her fork, she didn't shout. She didn't stand up. She looked at no one in particular for a moment, and then she looked at Michael, and she said, quietly but with perfect clarity, "I think we need to call off the wedding. I don't think I love you anymore. Not the way I should." The table went so completely silent that Michael could hear the refrigerator hum. He did not react visibly. He held his coffee cup with both hands and looked at her. The same level, measuring look from the kitchen, the look of a man assessing load-bearing capacity. And then he set the cup down carefully on the table, with the particular care of someone managing themselves by managing small objects. "Okay," he said. "Just that." David said something. Some reflexive attempt at recovery, the words of someone trying to fill a hole in the floor. And Petra touched Emily's arm, and there were voices suddenly, but Michael heard them from a distance. He was aware that his face was doing something neutral and controlled, and that this neutrality was genuine, which surprised him. He had expected, if this moment ever came, to feel demolished. Instead, he felt the particular hollow lucidity of someone whose worst suspicion has just been confirmed, which is a different thing from being surprised. They left the brunch separately. He drove home. She went somewhere. He didn't ask where, and she didn't say. He sat in the apartment for most of that afternoon. He didn't call anyone. He looked at the framed photo on the bookshelf, the two of them at her sister's wedding 2 years ago, Emily laughing at something off camera, and he thought about how well he knew that laugh and how little that knowing had apparently been worth. When she came home that evening, she was red-eyed and composed in the way people are after they have cried themselves to a particular resolution. "I should have talked to you privately," she said. "That was wrong of me." "Yes," he said. "I'm sorry." "I know you are." She looked at him. "I've been seeing Owen. I know you know. I suspected. I didn't plan it." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's probably the truest thing you've said to me in 2 months." She flinched. He hadn't intended it as cruelty, and she understood that, which was almost worse. "What do you want me to say, Michael?" "I don't want you to say anything," he said. "I think we've both been saying the wrong things for a while." He stood up. "I'll stay at my brother's tonight. We can figure out the practical things this week." He packed a bag without urgency, without theater. At the door he paused and looked back at her. Not with longing, not with anger, but with a particular expression of someone closing a book they've spent a long time reading. Finally, at the last page, "I hope it's what you think it is," he said, quietly, without bitterness. He closed the door behind him. The months that followed had their own slow logic. Michael moved into a one-bedroom across town, the kind of apartment that is sparse and functional and says "I am starting over" without any of the romance of that phrase. He called his mother and told her without embellishment. He managed the cancellations, the venue, the caterer, the photographer, with the same systematic competence he brought to everything, which some people mistook for coldness, and which was actually just the particular way he processed pain, by doing the next necessary thing. He was not fine, but he was not destroyed, and he was honest with himself about the difference. He went to work. He ran in the evenings. He called David sometimes, not to talk about Emily, but just to talk, and David, to his credit, followed Michael's lead and mostly didn't bring her up. Emily moved quickly into Owen's orbit. She told herself, and her friend Natalie, and her mother over the phone, that she had simply finally stopped living a half-life, that she had been honest with herself, that sometimes love runs its course and the courageous thing is to acknowledge it. These were not entirely false things. They were also not the whole truth. The whole truth contained something she was not yet ready to look at directly, that she had confused the feeling of being newly seen with the feeling of being loved, and that these are related but not the same. Owen was attentive and interesting for the first several months. Then he was attentive but slightly distracted. Then he was present in the way that people are present when they are also partly elsewhere. And Emily recognized this quality because she had recently spent 2 years embodying it herself. By late autumn she understood, in the specific way you understand things you've been avoiding, that Owen had not been falling for her so much as he had been falling for the version of her that existed in proximity to unavailability. Now that she was simply available, she was also, to him, somewhat ordinary. She would not have admitted this to anyone for months. She called Natalie on a Thursday in November and talked around it for an hour before she finally said, "I think I made a terrible mistake." Natalie, who had always liked Michael, said, "I know." "I don't mean with Owen specifically," Emily said, which was true and also not the whole point. What she meant, what she couldn't quite say yet, was that she had walked away from someone who had known her thoroughly and loved her anyway, and that she had done it in public, in front of their friends, at a table with mimosas and a frittata, and that the efficiency of her cruelty still surprised her when she let herself think about it. She thought about Michael's face at that table, the steadiness of it, the way he had set down his coffee cup. She thought about what he had said at the door, "I hope it's what you think it is," and the way it had contained no malice and therefore no protection from it. She had replayed that moment many times by now. Each time it weighed more. In December, Owen took a consulting project in Amsterdam. They decided, by mutual agreement and with little visible grief on either side, that they would not attempt the distance. The relationship ended with a particular quiet of things that were never fully built to begin with. Emily went back to her own apartment. She had kept it, suppleased to a friend, and stood in the empty living room on a Sunday afternoon and looked at the walls. The hooks where Michael's things had been were still there, small brass fixtures holding nothing. She picked up her phone, put it down, picked it up again. She reached out in January. She was not foolish enough to text. She called on a Wednesday evening, and he answered after 4 rings with the voice of someone who had known the call was coming and had decided, after consideration, to pick up anyway. "Emily. Hi." A pause. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." I almost didn't. A beat. How are you? I'm okay. I'm okay. She stopped. Restarted. I wanted to talk to you. Can we have coffee? Just coffee. He was quiet for a moment in a way she had learned to read over 4 years. Not absent, but thinking. The kind of quiet that meant he was deciding something carefully rather than reacting. Sure, he said. They met at a place near her apartment. A corner cafe with small tables and a window that looked onto a street, still wearing the last of the winter gray. He was there when she arrived, which was itself a kind of answer. Michael had always been early. It was one of the things she had loved and occasionally resented about him. His consistency, his reliability, the way he treated small commitments as binding contracts. He looked well, not triumphantly well, not the performatively thriving version of well she had half anticipated, just himself, quieter somehow, slightly refined by the year in the way that difficulty sometimes refines rather than diminishes. She sat down. A waitress came and went. They ordered coffee and did not immediately speak. Thank you for meeting me, she said. Of course. She had rehearsed this. She had practiced articulate versions of what she wanted to say, careful constructions of acknowledgement and regret. What came out instead was simpler. I'm sorry for how I did it. The brunch, I don't know what I was thinking. He looked at her. Not hard. Not forgiving either, just looking. I think you weren't sure you could do it at all, he said, so you did it in a way that made it impossible to take back. The accuracy of this hit her somewhere below the sternum. She had not considered it from that angle, and now that he'd named it, she recognized it as true, and the recognition was both a relief and a further indictment. Michael. She stopped. Her hands were around her coffee cup. I think I got very confused between what I wanted and what I thought I was missing, and I think I hurt you badly because of that confusion, and I know that doesn't fix anything. No, he said, simply, not coldly. Is there any? She stopped herself. I want to ask you something, but I don't want to be unfair to you by asking it. He waited. Do you think there's any version of this where we? She couldn't finish it. The sentence didn't really want to exist. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her, and his expression was the kind that takes years to develop. The particular combination of compassion and finality that comes from having genuinely worked through something. I spent a long time, he said slowly, thinking about whether what happened between us was something that could be, not undone but built around, whether two people could know what we know about each other now and still find their way forward. He paused, and I think the honest answer is that I'm not the same person who was waiting at that table anymore. I don't mean that as an accusation. I mean that he doesn't exist to come back to. She looked at him for a long time. She was not going to cry, she decided, not because she didn't feel it, but because she understood, finally, that her feelings were not the point of this conversation. That's fair, she said. They finished their coffee. They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. Her work, his work, a film they had both apparently seen recently on their separate evenings. And it was not painful so much as clarifying. The way touching a place you've broken is clarifying when it no longer hurts. They stood outside the cafe in the gray January air and said goodbye with a brief, careful embrace, and then she walked south, and he walked north, and neither of them looked back. She thought about him on the train home. Not with longing exactly, though there was something in the neighborhood of longing. She thought about how thoroughly he had known her. She thought about the ring she had returned by mail in a padded envelope with a short handwritten note. She had not been able to manage more than 6 lines, and now she understood that the brevity had been its own form of cowardice. She thought about his face at the brunch table, the coffee cup set down with such deliberate care, and she understood finally what that care had meant. Not control, but grief managed in real time. Grief that had already begun its work because he had suspected for weeks, had known in the part of him that knew things without wanting to. She had left him for someone who reflected her own hunger back at her, and she had called it love, and it had not been love. Or not only love, not the kind that builds rather than consumes. Michael, walking north through the January cold, thought about her for exactly 1 block, and then he thought about the project he had been drafting at work, and then he thought about dinner, and then he thought about nothing in particular, his breath visible in the cold air, moving at a steady pace through a city that was indifferent and therefore freeing. He was not over her. He would not claim that. But he had made his peace with the fact that some losses are true and complete, and that accepting their completeness is not the same as accepting defeat. He had loved her genuinely, and she had loved him imperfectly, and he had not been quite enough, of what she needed, and she had been unwilling to stay long enough to discover whether that was a permanent condition or a temporary one. And all of this was true simultaneously, and none of it resolved neatly into blame. He turned up the collar of his coat. A few blocks later, he passed a flower stand and stopped without thinking and bought a small bunch of something yellow, forsythia, still winter bare along the stems but opening at the tips. And he carried them home to his own table, his own apartment, his own particular life, which was emptier than it had been, and also, in some way he was only beginning to understand, more fully his. Some things end not with the violence of a rupture, but with the quiet, irreversible logic of a door that closes on its own. Not slammed, not locked, simply finished swinging. Emily would spend a long time understanding what she had walked away from, and the understanding would not be useless to her, though it would arrive too late to be of use to them. Michael would carry the weight of that year in the measured, private way he carried most things, not lightly, but without being crushed. They had loved each other, truly and imperfectly, in the particular way of two people who were right for each other in almost enough ways, and almost, in the end, is its own kind of grief.